If there's one theme that keeps popping up again and again in our interviews, it's change. How do international schools successfully navigate the twists and turns of the change process? At first, new ideas and the buzz around implementing them can feel electrifying. But here's the catch. Often the people involved, the processes, and the long-term sustainability of these ideas, whether they're initiatives or programs, don't quite make it past the starting line. So why does this happen? Audrey and I have been through countless new initiatives and programs in our schools over the years, and we often found ourselves wondering what makes some changes stick while others fall flat. That curiosity led us straight to Dr. Jim Reese. Many of you probably know Jim as the previous facilitator behind the Harvard Project Zero Summer Institutes, or as a trusted consultant in your own school. 11 years ago, Dr. David Perkins from the Harvard Graduate School of Education partnered with Jim to write what I consider a groundbreaking education article, When Change Has Legs: 4 Key Factors that help determine whether change efforts will be sustained over time. I had the privilege of interviewing Jim on my old podcast, the EdTech Co-op, about 10 years ago to discuss the article. You can find a link to that episode in the show notes. Now, in conjunction with the 11th anniversary of this influential article, we invited Jim back to share those timeless insights and his fresh lessons on managing them. Our guiding question for this episode was, what are proven ways to bring about sustainable change in our international schools? Jim broke down the legs that need to be solidly in place to keep changes standing tall and the common roadblocks that can make those legs wobble. The 4 legs of sustainable change are frameworks, the structures that guide and support learning; leaders, the people who champion and drive the process; community, the collective buy-in and engagement of everyone involved; institutionalization, embedding change so it becomes a part of the school's DNA. Make sure to check out our show notes to dive deeper into Jim's journey as an international educator and his role in spreading the Project Zero frameworks. This episode was recorded on April 14th, 2025. We now give you Dr. Jim Reese, a change expert who's passionate, connected, and laser-focused on helping students grow their thinking and understanding, central features of the learning process.
Hello, Jim. How are you? It's good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too, Audrey.
Yeah. So welcome to Educators Going Global. And we start by asking our guests where in the world they are. So tell us where you are.
So I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm sitting in my study in my apartment in the Adams Morgan neighborhood, and I can look out on my balcony and see the Washington Monument.
Very cool.
And Jim, you did go global recently. Where were you?
Yeah, so I just got back from a 4-week trip in China, and I was doing some work in a bilingual private school in Shanghai for 2 weeks of that 4-week trip. And it's an ongoing relationship I have with that school. And they're very interested in infusing Project Zero ideas, specifically teaching for understanding and thinking routines, into their curriculum and their pedagogical practices. So I'm helping them think about how that can happen from first grade through 12th grade. And then also, they're really interested in building a center for professional development that's based at the school that serves Shanghai and Eastern China. So I'm helping them think about that based on the work that I've done here in Washington.
That is so cool. And we will definitely get more into that in a little while. We'd like to start by asking you if you have a going global story from one of your experiences living and teaching overseas that you'd like to share. Have you got one for us?
Sure. It makes me think back to when I first started teaching internationally, and I was in Brussels, Belgium, and I was teaching in an international school there. And I had come from teaching in public schools in the state of Virginia here in the United States, and had never taught internationally, had never lived internationally, had never gone to an international school. So it was my first experience in an international school. And I would say about 2 or 3 months into teaching in my high school English classes, this realization dawned on me about perspective, about open-mindedness, and knowing that I had students coming from all over the world in my class with different perspectives, different cultural references, that kind of thing. I realized that I personally had to sort of drop the bias that I brought with me, being an American and having this sort of public school mindset and also very American mindset. And I had to understand that cultural references that I made needed to be broader, needed to be more open. I need to be more curious about the rest of the world. And it really set me on a path to doing a lot of advocacy work within that school and in other schools I've been in, whether they be international schools or US-based schools, thinking about how do we incorporate different perspectives, open-mindedness into our curriculum. And it's led me on a path toward thinking about those mindsets as being crucial for really good teaching as well.
All right, Jim, before we dive into the guiding question, we want to make a connection between your experience working with Harvard's Project Zero and their summer institutes and just Project Zero in general. In the second show, we're going to talk more about the summer institutes. So in this show, could you give us an overview of kind of the mission of Project Zero and maybe a little bit of your experience working with Project Zero?
Sure. I'll start with my experience, and that'll, I think, broaden to the larger mission and what Project Zero does. So I got involved with Project Zero back in the late 90s when I was teaching in Brussels. As I said, I was in Belgium. And Project Zero embarked on a project called Teaching for Understanding in the mid 1990s. They built a framework for how teachers can truly teach for understanding, really focus on understanding as the main goal in what they're doing in the classroom from early childhood through high school. And they embarked on a smaller project after they developed the framework with some international schools in Northern Europe. And so they built this consortium, and one of them was my school. And so every summer, the school would send 5 to 6 teachers to a small summer institute at Harvard. And we would dig into the Teaching for Understanding framework with the promise that we would try out some of the ideas in our own practice the next year. We'd stay in touch with the researchers. They would come visit to try to give us kind of a jolt of energy and inspiration. And then we would also have a spring conference with the European school teachers. And this went on for a number of years, about 8 years. And so I got involved with Teaching for Understanding that way. It had a really, really strong impact on my own practice. But then I also got involved with working to facilitate professional development workshops with teachers. So I got into that realm as well. Project Zero has always been interested in the conditions for optimal learning, for how we learn best, where we learn best, the environment around us, and how it can support learning. And so from its founding in 1967, it's really looked at the sort of complex terrain of what constitutes good teaching and learning. It's branched off into all kinds of other research areas, but they all come back to this idea of, what is understanding? How does it develop in various realms? And they've moved very, very strongly over the last 30, 35 years into the realm of thinking as well. Like, how do we make the moves as educators to really tap into good thinking with our students, encourage good thinking, and then develop good thinking so that they can reach that level of understanding that we want them to in whatever course we might be teaching or whatever grade level we might be teaching at. So they were really put on the map in the early 80s through Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Howard Gardner was one of the co-founders of Project Zero. So multiple intelligences theory was huge in bringing international prominence to Project Zero, but Teaching for Understanding also got a lot of currency in the United States and around the world, as have thinking routines that have been developed, again, in the last 30, 35 years. So that's been my involvement, and I've stayed involved off and on over the last 25, 30 years. At one point, I was helping to run their summer institutes. They had 2 different summer institutes at one point, the Future of Learning, and the other, which is still ongoing, is the Project Zero Classroom. And I was the education coordinator for both of those for a number of years, and then also served on the faculty until we started our own summer institute here in Washington. And I kind of stepped back, but I still do a lot of consulting around the world with these Project Zero ideas.
And that's the connection we're looking at as well, how Project Zero, all the various frameworks are around the world and in their outreach through their summer institutes, but now they do them year round, right? Mm-hmm. It's just not in the summer, right?
Right. They have online courses, so there's access any time of the year to these online courses, short online courses. They have a number of projects that are based in the United States and overseas that are ongoing. And then there are regional groups that have sprung up over the years. There's a group in Australia. There's been a group in California. We've got our group in DC. There are groups around the world as well that keep these ideas going on a local level.
And like I was saying earlier, when we do our second show with you, we're going to talk more about the professional learning, bringing in these frameworks into one's practice. So we'll take a deeper dive there. So this show is going to be about an article that you and Dr. David Perkins wrote. I guess last year was the 10th year anniversary. And I remember interviewing you for an earlier podcast I was on, and just how much that article affected me as a change agent, as an instructional technologist. It just makes so much sense. So we're going to unpack that article right now with you, and we're going to start with our guiding question of what are proven ways to bring about sustainable change in our schools, but we're going to say international schools because that's our focus. So that's the big broad question, and the title of the article is When Change Has Legs, 4 Key Factors Help Determine Whether Change Efforts Will Be Sustained Over Time. All right, so let's first start with you and Dr. Perkins. What led the two of you to write this article?
Yeah, so David Perkins has been a good friend and mentor of mine for many years. He's also one of the co-founders of Project Zero. He's now retired from his professorship at Harvard, but still active in writing, and he's a prolific writer and in leading some projects. He's on the steering committee of Project Zero as well. Every year at the Summer Institute, he gave a talk at the end of the week that proposed this framework, and it was very inspiring to me. I also used it kind of as a check on my own work in schools. I was in a school at the time when he first started giving this talk, and I was also starting this network that I've developed here in Washington of Project Zero practitioners. And I was really interested in school change. I'd been in a number of schools, both US public schools and international schools, and I saw how change quickly evaporated when certain elements weren't present. And I was really interested. I was very curious about it. I was really interested in how it happened. It happened in different ways in different settings. And so I was fascinated by his talk. And he started it with an example of working with the country of Colombia. Colombia had elected, this was back in the late 80s, I think, they had elected a very progressive government, national government, and were looking to reform education to make it more progressive. And they hired Project Zero to come down and work on developing a new curriculum, a new pedagogical practices that they would infuse into schools all over the country. And they did this for a number of years, and it was really, really exciting work. But in the next election, that government was swept out of office, and a new conservative government was brought in, and they stopped the initiative altogether. And that got David thinking about how whims and changes and so forth can upend really, really good work that might be happening in schools. But he also had worked with individual schools and school systems and that kind of thing around the country and around the world. So as this talk grew from that, and he then put his scholar hat on and thought about the change management theory, not only in business, but also that was emerging from schools. And he developed this framework that if you have these 4 legs in place, he used the growing legs and having legs that can move and be powerful. If you have those legs in place, then you have a much greater chance of sustaining the change. So I was very much inspired by this talk year after year. He gave it for several years. And at one point, after the work was really, really heating up for me here in DC, I wrote him a note and just said, hey, David, would you be at all interested in writing these ideas down? Because he had not published these ideas at that point. He had a few ideas came from different works he had written, but he had not put this framework out there other than in the talk. And I said, would you be interested in putting these ideas down on paper in an article? And I would love to bring in some of the practical experience that I have and that I know a lot of Project Zero practitioners around the world have had in sustaining this kind of change, because there's a lot of really good work that's happening in international schools and in other schools around the US and around the world. So he said, sure, let's do it. So we got together and put the ideas down in writing. And so he already had the framework in place. And so we explained the framework in the article, and then we go through and talk about what each leg entails, and then what are some impediments, and then what are some things we've learned through practitioners and schools to support this kind of work. So that's the origin story of the article and how it's laid out.
Well, it's great that you were the impetus behind him putting these ideas out there and getting them in writing. Because if you want to have change, you need to have things documented, right? So it kind of ties in nicely with the whole idea. So the first leg that you're referring to is frameworks.
Mhm.
Maybe you can go into that a little more for us.
Sure. So by frameworks, we meant pedagogical frameworks in particular. So frameworks that really support teachers in achieving a certain kind of goal. And we were very interested, especially in frameworks that really support deeper learning. So while there are a number of frameworks like that come from Project Zero, we were trying to broaden it to say that it's not just Project Zero that does this kind of work. Those frameworks exist in all kinds of ways, but you need frameworks in place for teachers to really develop the common language across a school, especially if it's a pre-K through 12 school, or even just a high school or an early childhood center. You need to have common language about what we mean about learning, about teaching, about complex ideas. And so frameworks give you that kind of language. But we had examined a number of frameworks and found there were certain flaws in some, there were certain strengths in others, and we pulled out some of those strengths, and we decided that the frameworks that seemed to have the eligible criteria to be a strong leg in this larger framework about change were those that were flexible, that teachers could adapt them to their own personal beliefs about teaching and learning, that it could fit alongside practices, especially for an experienced teacher who might have 20 or 30 years of teaching experience. A new framework being introduced doesn't need to be completely new to that teacher. It needs to have some kind of familiarity. The teacher needs to be able to see how it really can extend the learning that is happening in the classroom. So we really looked for that kind of flexibility. The framework, for it to be powerful, needs to be consistent with the school goals, with the school's mission, with initiatives that the school is supporting. And it needs to sit comfortably next to other frameworks that the school might have. So the school might have a framework that is really looking at behavior. And so the framework about pedagogical practices needs to sit comfortably with that. You can't have one that's really doctrinaire and another one that is really loose. There's going to be an inherent inconsistency in implementation and in just students' understanding of how these work when you're going from one extreme to another. So we were looking at frameworks, and we gave a list in the this article is 11 years old now, but we gave a list of some frameworks that are still around, that are still really powerful, that we think are really good in this realm. But it's not an exhaustive list. There are many, many others.
And to that point, like understanding by design is not a Project Zero framework.
No.
But the list does have several Project Zero ones. One of the things that really reached out to me in the article was the idea of like a person putting on a new suit or new clothing. And what you all were talking about was that the clothing also needed to adapt to the person, not just the person adapting to the clothing, but the clothing morphs to fit the person. So, and you mentioned that, but I thought that was a great way to frame that. So how about the role of leaders? And I'm going to make that plural.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, leaders, it's really important to have more than one leader in these kinds of change initiatives in a school. Another piece that David Perkins had developed over the years that he included in his talk that I referenced earlier is that he talked about these change initiatives needing both a practical visionary and a political visionary. And he also talked about sort of the intellectual or ideological visionary, someone who or something that provides the grounding, the intellectual grounding for it. And the framework can provide that itself. So we really focused in the article on the idea of the practical visionary and the political visionary. The political visionary is often the head of school or the principal, but it's the person who has authority to introduce the framework in the school, to say this is something we believe in, this is something we endorse, but also to stand behind it. So if things get tough, that political visionary is actually going to stand behind it and say, here's why we're doing it. Everybody needs to be on board, or we need to at least consider it, or whatever approach the principal or head might be taking. And so you need that person who, and we use the term conspicuous commitment, who gives conspicuous commitment to the framework or to the change initiative that's happening. And it can't just be a kind of a passing, oh, you go off and do this thing, and report back to me in 3 months and tell me how it's going, because most likely the change is going to fail. It's never going to take hold. But that political visionary needs to really be behind it. Something that I learned over the years too from David and in my own experience is that the political visionary doesn't have to be an expert in whatever change initiative you're going, or the framework or whatever it is. Needs to know enough to be able to talk about it with parents, with teachers, with staff, that kind of thing, but doesn't have to be deeply, deeply ensconced in it. Those political visionaries, or that political visionary, needs to just be able to show up when it's important, to stick around. There have been so many professional development workshops I've attended or I've led when administrators sit in the back on their laptops, not paying any attention, and teachers notice. Teachers notice when the people with the power in the school don't participate and don't seem to really care, or they don't show up at all. And what we were really trying to say is that where we've seen change really take hold is where the leaders have been involved, they've shown up, and they've given their political backing to the initiative over and over again so that it has this kind of weight, and teachers know that it matters. So that's been really, really important for us. The practical visionary can be a person, it can be a team, but it needs to be a consistent group of people or person who's going to make things happen on the ground. The political visionary, a principal or a head of school, is being pulled in so many different directions that there needs to be a team or a person who can actually make things happen, order food, order supplies, make sure there's a room reserved, but also knows this work inside and out, so can also stand up in front of a group with credibility and lead workshops or bring in people who are going to be attuned to the culture of the school and can really move the faculty forward. So those two elements, the practical visionary and the political visionary, are really, really important in terms of the leadership. And so we deal with, in the article, with a number of ways that those leaders do show up, that those leaders try to get people on board and try to sustain the change over time.
Yeah, I think if your leaders aren't behind it and aren't demonstrating that they're behind it, you're really going to struggle. So I think that's really important. I agree.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Jim, real quick, before I forget, and this is maybe something you'll talk about right at the end, there's been such a growth of middle leaders. That's been something that's been happening in the last several years. You were talking about this 11 years ago. So would middle leaders, team leaders, study group leaders, are they some of the practical leaders that you're thinking about?
I think they're a byproduct of the practical visionary. The practical visionary needs to be, it could be the director of teaching and learning. It could be a teacher who takes on the role, or a team who might do that, but they need to be looking for those practitioners and those early adopters who are going to be able to lead and become those middle leaders. But I do have some things I want to say about that later on, maybe in the second podcast, because I want to talk about how to make PD stick in international schools.
One other aspect, one other leg is community. Maybe you can explain to us what we're talking about there.
Yeah, so when we talk about community in the article, we're talking about the stakeholders within a school or a school system. So, of course, we're talking about the teachers, building these ideas into that community, about the parents, about, it could be students, the board, if the school has a board, or board of trustees, or any kind of board that governs it. And then sometimes it's even the wider community. So the school I was in Washington, D.C., sits within a residential community. And so we had to have really good relations with the people who lived around the school as well. And so we thought about our community as being wider than just the school grounds. So the community piece is really, really important in terms of sustaining change, because you really need to have buy-in from all of these stakeholders. They need to be educated on why the school is embarking on this change and why it's important to the health of the school. So, for example, having parent information sessions is really, really important to do when you've got your act together and you know how to share this. And you can maybe share some examples of how this is making a difference in children's lives in particular classrooms, maybe at a certain grade level or in a certain department. At schools I've been in, we've done parent workshops. So parents have come in the evening, and teachers who are leading this initiative have led workshops for an hour to give the parents a sense of what it's like to learn in that classroom. And we've had parents leave saying, I wish my schooling was like this. This is the kind of schooling I've always dreamed of having. And I'm so grateful that my children have this. You can't script that any better. I mean, that's what you want parents to be saying about your school. And so we've done that kind of outreach to parents. We've done that for our board. We had at the school I was last in, we had a board of trustees. So we would do workshops for the board. I would regularly go to the board meetings and do workshops with them. So I would model the practices that were happening in the school. We did a lot of work with museums. And so we would do a lot of working with art and objects from museums as well with parents and with board members. So that was really important. We also believed that with teachers, that there needs to be a certain kind of permeability to the change initiative, so that if you're going to have someone come in and say, this is what we're doing, everybody needs to be on board, you're going to be held accountable for it, you could be fired if you don't do it. If you come in with that kind of top-down approach, most likely teachers will show that they're compliant, but they'll close their doors to their classrooms and they'll continue doing what they've always done. And they'll be quite subversive. And somehow, once that person goes away, who's made that authoritative stand, then the change initiative will go away as well. And they'll say, we'll outlast that leader or whoever is telling us this. So the idea is, if you have permeability with the change initiative, so that you really look for people who want to get on board, you get them excited about it, you get them to try things out, and you get them to have a kind of an infectious energy that will bring some of their colleagues along. And you give people different ways to be involved. You don't have to have the full commitment necessarily. You're happy with people showing some commitment and that commitment growing over time. So really understanding the ecosystem of a school, that teachers might have young children at home. They might have parents they're taking care of. They might have other demands on them that keep them from being fully committed all of the time to the change initiative. But as long as they're not subverting the change initiative and they're trying some things on, and you're giving them different opportunities, maybe during the school day, so they don't have to stay after school or they don't have to come back in the evenings. You're just giving them ways to be involved and to try things on, so that you're building the critical mass that you need to keep the change going. We found that was really, really, really important. Another thing that I've learned over the years, and we don't say much about this in the article, but it's something that I've learned, is that documentation of the change initiative is really, really important. So documentation around the school to show evidence of the change taking place, the thinking that might be happening with students that's different from what we used to do or what they used to do, and having documentation for visitors to the school to see as well. Those might be parents, they might be guests from other schools, but they see that this is who we are, this is what we believe in, this is our DNA now. That piece is really important in building community. And anybody new coming into the school, it's really important to give them an orientation around the change initiative, why it's important, and to get them excited about it and to give them a chance to be involved. So having a welcoming orientation, but also being very clear about this is what we're doing, and being very transparent. I mean, we're in our second year of this change initiative, but we believe that it's something that's going to benefit the school in the long run, and we're in it for the long haul, so that people coming in know that that's what they've signed on for. So those are the kinds of things we think about with community.
I was going to ask about measurement and the word accountability, which can carry a little bit of uneasiness with people. But the idea of measuring, just that, look at our successes, look at where we tried something, it didn't quite work out. How are we going to learn from that? And I'm always a believer in finding ways to celebrate what people are doing. And it builds a climate of community that we're in this together. So speaking of the community, the fourth leg of institutionalization, what does that entail?
This is probably the trickiest one, because change initiatives start off a little bit shakily. There might be a lot of excitement around something in the first year, and then it could easily peter out. We've noticed that in schools over and over again, that the school will get really excited about something. It will last for a year or two, and then they'll move on to something else. Or there might be way too many initiatives going on, and it's like survival of the fittest. Only one or two might have lasting power that might go 2 or 3 years. But most change initiatives seem to kind of peter out before the 5-year mark. And so that's problematic. So institutionalization is when you see that the change initiative is growing these legs and has the staying power, then there's a real need to then start to institutionalize, because things aren't going to stay the same in any school. As we know, in international schools, there's a lot of transience, a lot of coming and going with families, with teachers, with administration. And that's the case in a lot of schools, just typical public schools or private schools as well in the United States. So the idea that you institutionalize these change practices to really say, this is who we are. Again, this is our DNA. So you put in writing, Dave, as you were saying, holding people accountable, but also showing the evidence for the work having been meaningful. We did a lot of work in my last school on getting our work out there in the public realm. So writing articles about what we're doing, having podcasts, making videos, having a video record of some of these practices going on in schools, just finding a way to put it out there. So potential teachers we might be recruiting to come into the school can see that, can understand that. And so they come in knowing that that's the DNA of the school. Potential parents who might be wanting to choose our school will see that. And we rewrote a lot of our documents that are on our website or that we give to prospective parents to include the work that we were doing with Project Zero. So putting it in writing, putting it in publications, all of that was really, really important for us to institutionalize it. Putting these practices in, if we have a teacher evaluation plan, putting these practices, what we expect to see in a classroom at X school, these are the kinds of things that make up a really powerful classroom and that you're going to be evaluated on. That can be really important. We've done that at the school I was speaking of. Thinking about how you hire and the kinds of questions that get at the kind of teaching that you're wanting to bring in. You don't necessarily have to have a teacher who is doing all of this brilliantly, but you want a teacher who's going to be open to learning, who's going to crave professional development, who's going to crave growth. And so that idea of hiring the right kind of people to come into the school who are going to keep the initiative going and bring a new kind of excitement to it. Oftentimes, trying to find people also who have some expertise they can bring to the school that might fill some gaps that you still have. And then just having ongoing PD and making sure that that PD is preserved from one year to the next. So there's a budget line that supports this kind of work. There's a way, maybe there's a time during the year when you have an exhibition of learning. So you create traditions in the school and you show teacher and student learning in those exhibitions of learning or celebrations of learning. All those kinds of things are really, really important to build in. One thing that we've done in educating our board is help them to know that when they hire a new head of school and when the head of school goes in to hire new principals or assistant principals, that these kinds of questions are being asked too, like, what are you going to do to sustain this initiative within the school? Because we believe that it's made us a better school. We believe that this is who we are. We don't want to abandon this in any shape or form. So all those things are really, really important to institutionalizing the practices. And usually around year 3 or year 4 is when that kind of institutionalization should start taking place if the change initiative is going to take hold and last.
I like the term, we've heard this in other contexts, but I like the term part of the DNA because it really does give a feel for this is just who we are. This is just what we do. This is something that will outlive any given person who comes or goes from the school. So thank you for describing each of the legs. And it sounds like if you have the 4 legs or the 5, if we want to talk about the documentation as well, in place, there's a good chance that your change will be sustained. But maybe you can tell us what are some of the impediments to sustaining change in schools or school systems, whether they be public, private, or international schools.
Sure. Yeah. In the article, we deal with some impediments, and I'll talk about some of those, but also some that I've discovered or experienced in the last 11 years as well. I'll go through the 4 legs as well and thinking about those impediments, and then maybe talk about a few more global ones as well. So in terms of the frameworks, one of the impediments, and I alluded to this earlier, is that the school could have too many. So teachers don't know what's coming and what's going because there are so many different change initiatives. And every year there are 3 more that are layered in. And so teachers sort of pick and choose, and they might not have fidelity to any of them, but they're at least trying out something in their classroom. But it's really kind of just pick and choose, and you don't see consistency across classrooms or across the divisions of the school, that kind of thing. So there are just too many initiatives going on, too many frameworks. So as a school leadership team, as a faculty, you need to settle on 2 or 3 that are really compatible, flexible, that work well together. And then you've got this momentum that's going. And, one thing we did at my school, this last school I was in, was working with Understanding by Design for several years before I came in, and then switched to Teaching for Understanding. But they still use some of the nomenclature for Understanding by Design. Well, I knew both frameworks quite well, and they're very compatible. They're both aiming for the same thing. They just use different terminology, and they have certain different emphases. But I know them well, and I think they both have pluses and minuses. So I can work with both fine. So what I did when I came in as the director of studies is I said, okay, you've got this nomenclature, but you've also committed to doing work with teaching for understanding. If we really believe in understanding, let's not get bogged down in which framework we're using. Let's meld the two. And so we took some of the nomenclature from one and some of the nomenclature from the other, but we really spent a lot of time understanding what each of those terms meant and how they play out in the classroom. And it didn't matter what the nomenclature was, as long as we had the shared language that we could then use across the school. And so that was really, really important for us to do. So again, finding those frameworks, the one or two or three frameworks that really, really help in accomplishing the goal is really, really important. Frameworks can also be very dense, so the terminology might be too obscure or might not fit comfortably with the school. I'll give you a quick example. I taught in a bilingual school. We had French, Spanish, and English as our main languages. And so we had faculties who were fluent, who were native French speakers, native Spanish speakers, native English speakers. And we took on a framework at one point called Agency by Design. And we really worked on how do you build student agency through making. And it was really compatible with teaching for understanding. It was really pushing us to a higher level in the work we were doing in our classrooms. But the word agency doesn't translate into French or Spanish at all in terms of the way we use it in English. And so we spent time just thinking about how do you say this in a pithy way in Spanish and in French. And then we've got our Chinese program with a couple of Chinese teachers. So how do we say it in Mandarin? And the concept exists, but the terminology wasn't the same. And so understanding that, being sensitive to the cultural differences within the school and also how the terminology might not work. So let's find a better term. And so that kind of time spent on honoring the cultural background of your teachers, of the experiences of your teachers is really, really important so that the framework has the chance to be successful. But some frameworks can just be too dense. They can be too rigid. David talked about that metaphor of trying to close on, and it needs to not only fit you, but you need to somehow fit into it. So it's really important that the frameworks have this kind of flexibility, adaptability in them. And when they don't, then it's a huge impediment. Teachers, again, will just close their door and do what they want to do and not take it on. When it comes to leaders, some of the impediments are, and again, we've alluded to these already, some of the impediments are that leaders come and go. And so you lose your political visionary, a new person comes in who doesn't really believe in the change or doesn't really care that much about it or gives lackluster support to it or undermines it in other ways, then it can easily just go away. And that happens sometimes faster than we can possibly imagine. Or the practical visionary or the team disbands or they leave the school, they retire, and then there's nobody to sort of keep that day-to-day support going. That can be very, very problematic for it as well. If teachers perceive that things are not going to be organized, they're going to show up for meetings and the room hasn't been reserved or there's no food or whatever else, they'll quickly get frustrated with the ideas. And, some ideas might still last in certain classrooms where there are people who really believe in them, but it won't be an organized project that's moving forward. So the leadership, being consistent with the leadership, but also you can prevent some of those things by thinking about how you hire. So making sure you replace someone who leaves the school with someone who has the commitment or finding the talent within the school to take on those roles. And sometimes those things change over time. Maybe one person was doing it, but the job became too big for one person. So you need a team of people who can share the load, or you need if you're a multi-divisional school, to have a point person in each division who's going to do it. There's all kinds of ways that schools are structured and can use those structures to support the change initiative. But there needs to be that kind of succession plan for leaders in place. And it needs to be talked through. It needs to be adjusted over time, because probably the number one impediment to change lasting is the personnel. And we know in international schools, that's huge because people are coming and going so often. So you just have to be really, really smart about hiring, about cultivating leaders, about making this part of the DNA if it's going to last in an international school. When it comes to community, one of the biggest impediments we found was that in some of the schools we worked with early on with teaching for understanding and with some of the thinking routines and cultures of thinking work we were doing back in the early 2000s, one of the biggest impediments was that oftentimes you'd get these really excited early adopters, and they'd come back to school after going to a summer institute or to a workshop, and they'd be so excited about it. But since they owned the knowledge and they loved owning that knowledge, there was a certain thrill and power that came along with that. And it created kind of an in-group, out-group kind of behavior within the school that created resentment around the initiative. And so you've really got to work against that idea that any group owns this. It's got to be owned by everyone. It's got to be shared. And that's why the permeability piece is so important, that there are ways that you're welcoming people in. There are ways that you can do this and still be considered, a good soldier in the fight to really change the school for the better. So militating against an out group is really, really important, and keeping it going. And I think, again, transparency is so important. I talked about ways to keep the initiative transparent and to share with parents, to share with students if that's appropriate, to share with board members, to share with the wider community. And not doing that, keeping things under wraps, builds a kind of skepticism or cynicism or doubt about the initiative. What are they doing? Why are they trying these things out? Why are they not telling us about it? So that's really, really important to think about how transparent you can be.
Well, Jim, let me ask you about the whole idea of the initial movement on these programs is to be flexible, how to make it fit to a lot of the things you're already doing. And now you're bringing up the potential where it becomes almost you're indoctrinated into this, and you maybe have some power people who are the leaders. What about those new people coming in, especially in international schools, who we want to validate and celebrate their ideas? And you were saying you would have orientation and PD to bring them in. How does one deal with that potential clash?
Yeah, so I think you need to be really transparent in the hiring process. And again, if you've really paid attention to the different legs and you've got a framework that's flexible, you've also done a lot of work on nomenclature and why we do these things. And you've got people in the school, not just the principal or not just the head of school, who are saying these things, but other teachers are saying these things. You bring people in who are quite experienced and who might have some skepticism, and skepticism is really healthy. You want people to come in and challenge what you're doing. You want people to come in and ask questions. Why do we do it this way? But you also want to have traditions that make sense and that have been thoughtfully put into place so that someone coming into a new school, you need to have people who have that disposition to be open and to be curious and to actually be adaptable to these changes. Because if you're going into a new school, you shouldn't be able to come in and just teach the way you were always teaching in your like traditional public school back in country X and expect that that's the way that we teach here. You've got to be adaptable. So you've got to get at those things in an interview, in the hiring process, to know that these are the kinds of things we really value. If you don't really value those things, then maybe this isn't a good match for you. But if you do value those things, then come in and we'll help you do that. But we think you have a lot to offer us as well. I think you really do have to honor the experience that people bring into schools. And if you're treating them as if they're beginning teachers or they're beginning on a journey, then you're going to alienate them. So you've got to honor what they bring, understand how it fits into what you're doing, and expect that the initiative is going to expand and change and go in different directions over time. And it might be year 7 or year 8, you're ready to move on to something else. You've made a really, really, really careful decision about that moving on. The moving on shouldn't be like changing total direction. The moving on should be, oh, we're seeing that this is something that we could do a lot better. Let's work on this now because we've got all these things fundamentally strong within the school. But we need to do some fine tuning every once in a while. But this new initiative is really going to take us in a great direction. So you've got to just be really thoughtful about that instead of the new flavor of the month or the new flavor of the year kind of approach that many, many schools take on. And then with the final leg, with impediments to institutionalization, really a lot of these other impediments work against institutionalization. So I would say I can't think of things that are specific to institutionalization, but these other things, when you've made the decision that it's time to really look at our website and change the language we have there, really promote this initiative, explain why, when we're changing the admissions documents that we give to parents or that we share with parents, when we're putting articles out there in the world to laud the work that's happening, but also raising the big questions we have about teaching and learning and showing that we're on a journey. It's not done. It's not fixed. We've done this for 3 years now. We're the perfect school, but that we're on this journey to really digging into complexity and really thinking about how that changes with each generation of students. All those kinds of things are out there. And so people have a good sense of what this school is all about by looking at the website, by looking at materials, by reading articles about it, by searching the web about it, those kinds of things. You've worked on institutionalization at that point. And if you haven't put those other 3 legs in place in a really powerful way, then the institutionalization doesn't matter because the change initiative is going to go away or it's going to dissipate or it's going to just be apparent in just some classrooms, but not in all classrooms. And that's not institutionalization. So I'm not pointing to one thing that's going to work against institutionalization. It's really all those things that I mentioned earlier.
All right, Jim. So You're working all over the world, and Project Zero is helping students and teachers all over the world. With our focus on international schools, we're wondering what advantages and disadvantages you see international schools having in general
Mm-hmm.
compared with U.S. public schools when it comes to implementing new initiatives and programs. Just what are a couple advantages and disadvantages for international schools in general?
So international schools have a great advantage in the transients. I'd also say it's a great disadvantage. So let me talk about the advantage first. In that the typical international school, not all international schools, but the typical international school, its students change, its faculty changes, its administration fairly regularly. There are a lot of new people coming in, there are a lot of people leaving. Everybody knows that in any kind of organization, you want to have some senior people who've been there for a long time, who keep the traditions going, who have the school history. You have the sort of middle level people who've been there for a good like 7 to 15 years, who have really settled in, but still relatively new, but also still working on things and have a lot of energy. And then you have new people coming in who might have a lot of experience, but they are new to this school culture and are going to be questioning things, are going to be trying new things, sharing new things, bringing new ideas. All that's really, really healthy. And international schools often have that kind of mix. And those that don't have that mix often have a short shelf life. I mean, they're not going to last very long, or they're going to be in perpetual chaos, or nobody's going to know who's coming or going. So you've got to have those kinds of things in place. That is an advantage in that when you do a really good job with hiring and you bring in people who are going to share their ideas, share their practice, they're really excited about the professional development you have to offer. They're really excited about being recognized for their experience, but they're also excited about the opportunity to work in a school that has a very clearly defined mission, really clear goals about teaching and learning. Then there's a really wonderful opportunity to keep that change initiative moving. And it's not going to move in the same direction every year, but it's going to keep moving, and it's going to be infused with certain kind of energy. And it's going to energize the people who are already there. So the hiring piece and the orientation piece are really, really important to make that happen. And then finding those traditions within the school year that sustain it as well. So you've got ongoing PD, you've got learning groups, you've got celebrations of learning, you've got ways that teachers can be in other teachers' classrooms, the way that they can share with one another, the way that you use meeting time to really talk about teaching and learning and not just administrivia. So there are all kinds of things that are important for keeping those things going. And international schools, I think, by being transient places, have a wonderful opportunity to take advantage of that. The downside is that with so many people coming and going, you could lose key people year after year after year, and you're having to renew that. And if you don't have systems in place to build leadership, to build middle leaders, to have the political visionary consistently standing, even if it's a different person every 3 or 4 years, if that person isn't consistently showing up, isn't consistently standing for the change initiative, then again, things move on and the change initiative can fall apart. My experience in international schools, not only as a teacher in international schools or administrator in international schools, but also just working with many schools as a consultant, is that the better schools tend to have pretty stable faculty. Yes, there's a lot of coming and going, but there's a stable faculty who are there for the long haul. And they're the institutional memory, and they're the ones you really need to build up. And they need to hold this change initiative as something that's really important to them. And if they do move on, there's a chance they take it with them to another school or another school system. And that's a really wonderful thing. Then you can build partnerships across schools or across regions that can help sustain it as well. And that's something that we've done in Washington by building an ecosystem that supports this work. We've got a number of schools that are really invested in these ideas, and they support one another. And teachers move from one school to the next, and they bring those ideas with them. And if they're really good teachers and really strong leaders, then those ideas can take hold in the new places.
Yeah, so I guess the one concern is that so many people come in with their new greatest, coolest idea that was from their last place. And you mentioned this earlier, but initiative fatigue can definitely be a thing because whose idea is the really great, best one? And like you said, you have to choose only a very limited number because otherwise people just get overwhelmed and they may or may not choose one or two of them, or they may just close their door and go in their classroom and do what the heck they
Mm-hmm.
want and not buy into any of them. So anyway, I just had to, that's an aside.
It's a real danger, and I've seen it in so many schools I've worked in. It's been the reason sometimes I've left a school because I saw someone come in and completely upend the work that we'd been doing for many years and brought in something new or wanted to put his own imprint on it and took it in a completely different direction that just didn't feel compatible with the way I believed in teaching and learning. So that's a real danger in any school system. I see it in the public school system here in the District of Columbia that every time we get a new chancellor, and we've had, I think, 4 in the past 7 or 8 years, every new chancellor comes in with new initiatives and brings a new staff. And there's just a real upending of change that's been happening, and it stalls progress sometimes that's been made. And sometimes it's needed change, but then that chancellor goes away and a new chancellor comes in and starts something all over again. And it's really problematic to not come in as a leader to get to know the culture and get to know the faculty, get to know what the history of the school is and what the history of the change initiative is before actually trying to put your imprint on it. I really believe in somebody coming in and spending a year just getting to know a school. You got to keep things running well, but you don't come in and change things without knowing who you're working with and what you're working with.
Yeah, and I would say that in international schools, because as you said, of all the turnover, that's an even more frequent thing that happens. And yeah, it's just something to guard against.
Yeah.
So here's a question. It's been 10 years since the article was published. What are some lessons learned regarding change management since you published it, and what would you add to a new version of the article?
Yeah, several things come to mind, and I think it won't be earth-shattering for me to say these things. I think we've touched on them already, but I think in a deeper, more complex way, I've come to understand, for example, that leadership really does matter, that the quality of leadership and the tone that a leader has in addressing faculty and talking about these things is really, really, really important. And I've just seen change initiatives evaporate almost overnight when a really good leader leaves and someone who's just lackluster comes in, and teachers feel they don't have anyone to look to anymore. And again, they might keep things going in their own classroom, but there's no impetus within the whole school ecosystem to keep things going. And that's problematic. I believe change initiative requires work every day. And that's why the practical visionary or visionaries are so important in a school. The people who keep it going on a day-to-day basis and who meet regularly with teachers, who remind everyone about why this is important, what we're doing, and here's what you can expect coming up, and finding rewards to give to people who are really demonstrating the fidelity to the framework or to the change initiative and doing some really, really excellent work. And I think where a lot of schools fail is they expect that, okay, we put this thing into place. We spend a lot of money on sending people out to workshops or conferences. They've come back and they've shared, and we did some things for a year. Now let's move on because we've got that in place. And then they don't ever pay attention to the fine tuning. That change initiative goes away. You get new people in the school. They don't know anything about it. And it just, over time, it just evaporates. So having those middle leaders in place, the practical visionaries who can work on this every day and just keep it at the forefront is really, really important. And I think I've learned a lot about how that happens in a positive way and how that can happen in a way that can undermine the work as well if it's the wrong person to be doing that work. I think it really helps, and I mentioned this in my last long comment, I think it really helps to build partnerships with other schools, like-minded schools. Teachers have contacts outside of the school, colleagues who teach the same thing or similar things. Again, we have museum partnerships. We have partnerships with nonprofits around the DC area. And so you have all these opportunities for growth. And it's about educating teachers oftentimes beyond their own subject area or their own grade level so that they're showing that they're curious individuals. They're showing that they know how to learn and they're lifelong learners. So building these partnerships can help sustain the initiative because you get other people excited about what you're doing in your school and you're excited about sharing it. And so everybody is building this excitement. And then this idea that things can evaporate overnight is something that I really do lose sleep over, that change is always very fragile. And these initiatives, hardly anything's ever going to last like 15, 20 years. I will say this work that happened in the previous school I was in has lasted over 20 years. It hasn't always been at its strongest. And I would say the first 6 or 7 years were it was touch and go. But for the last 17 years, it's been pretty consistently strong. There have been good years and bad years, but it's still there and it's still who we are. It's in our DNA. And I just can't imagine that it could go away overnight. But again, I saw it happen in another school across town this year, that some of the best work happening in a school was in this particular school. Got a new principal. It went away overnight because that principal doesn't believe in it. Some of the teachers in the school believe in it, but they're looking for other jobs. So that kind of thing happens. So that's the kind of thing I don't know where there's nothing that's foolproof, right? You've got to work for these things, work against the impediments, but still it's very fragile. And the best advice I can give to people is that when the change goes away and you don't have that support anymore, it's time to move on to another school. That's not a happy note to end on.
Getting the buy-in is just, and I liked your idea of getting partners in other schools who are also thinking along a similar line, and then partners in the community like the museums that can sustain the excitement even when there is some turnover in the personnel.
Yeah.
Those sound like some ways to hopefully keep it going, but also we all know, how fragile it can be. So I appreciate that.
I know that when I left my school last year, I sort of semi-retired in August, and I planned it out for a good year or two, the fact that I was going to leave. And I left, with really, really positive feelings about the school and feeling really, really good about it. And I really wanted this work that I'd been invested my, blood, sweat, and tears and over the past 16 years, I really wanted it to last. So I really invested myself in finding a successor, finding a replacement who would believe in the work as passionately as I believed in it, and who would take the work in new directions and do things that I didn't feel I was capable of doing. So I worked really hard within the school and the ecosystem of the school to make sure that the people who were going to do the hiring were looking for that same kind of person. And we were fortunate enough to have that person within our community, not within the school, but within the wider community that we had built over the last 16 years. And it happened. And it's going just as I hoped it would, and in so many new directions that I never would have dreamed of that are really, really positive for the school. So that kind of investment is really important. Going back to the idea of advantages of international schools is that there's this international school community. I mean, I know people through my work in international schools, I know people in international schools all over the world. And I do a lot of recruiting from my school, but also for other schools when I know somebody's really good and I put my name behind that person. I say, you really want this person on your staff. This is what this person can bring to your school. These 15 things or assets that this person brings. You really want this person. This is a real change agent. This person will bring people along, that kind of thing. So I think the international schools have that network of other international school teachers who have reputation. So really tapping into that. And that's why the regional networks are great, but even building your own networks of schools that are like-minded, where you know some people and you can get things going. So for example, right now in Northern Europe, we're working with a number of schools that are really, really excited about the cultures of thinking work. And they have sort of created their own informal network. They tap into the regional network they belong to of international schools, but they're getting together on a regular basis and they're going out to different conferences to share their ideas, hoping to build this kind of ecosystem in Northern Europe that we've built in DC. So we're helping them do that.
To our listeners, I know you're finding what Jim is talking about with outreach, community connections, very enticing, because we're going to cover that with more depth in our second interview with Jim. So he's just giving the start of it, and we're going to dig deeper. Jim, it's impressive what you did at your previous school, and I worked there not in the same division that you were in, and I was just constantly in awe with your leadership and the way you built frameworks within the school with the learning groups. That's one of the things that really I thought so much of way before I think we started talking about PLCs and things like that. You were doing them a long time ago. And we're going to talk more about that also in the second show. So to wrap this show up, is there anything else you'd like to share about the article?
The person I mentioned who replaced me at my school, she and I were together in China doing the work in the bilingual school a couple of weeks ago. And she was making a reference to the article because it meant a lot to her. She was a principal of a school. And she made reference to the article, talking about how important it was to her and her own leadership and change in her school. And she said, I think there's a When Change Has Legs Part 2, and I think you and I should sit down and write it. So she's sort of playing the role that I played with Dave Perkins 11 years ago. And so I thought, oh, that's funny, just a throwaway line. But I've been thinking about it ever since. So 3 weeks later, I've come up with a few key pieces that I'd really like to include in that. So maybe I'll use that as a teaser to open the next podcast with.
Excellent idea. All right, Jim, now that you're in semi-retirement, how can people follow you and your ideas and what you're up to?
Probably the easiest way is just on LinkedIn.
Right.
I'm on there as Jim Reese, and I post articles that are interesting to me. I have conversations with people, that kind of thing. That's probably the easiest way.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jim, for digging into your article and your ideas and talking about change and how to put systems into place so that it is sustainable and just looking at it from so many different angles and really helping people understand what it means to initiate a change and put factors into place that will
Yeah.
ensure its longevity, hopefully. And really, your experience and your wisdom around this are impressive. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it was fun. I hope I was somewhat coherent.
Cheers, Jim. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.